Tales of the Missing Travelers, Part 1. Sylvie. I drove home from work as the blizzard encompassed everything in its path. The radio blasted sad AM songs, as it was the only station that I could get. I needed the sound of any sort of music to calm my anxiety as I crossed the old Livingston Bridge. Through the woods to my house, I went, traveling along Riverview Road toward Ballston Heights. How the bridge was even still crossable was beyond me. It was a tiny 2-lane thing and had rusted rails sticking up from the sides. Inspections were supposedly done every year, but no idea how they passed. I drove under the meager 25-mile-per-hour speed limit, barely hitting 15. I secretly said a prayer to myself as I passed a motorist speeding at least 45 miles per hour. I felt my tiny car shaking from the wind as the car sped by me. I didn't blame the motorist when I really thought about it. The area was often referred to as Helltown, and honestly, it creeped me out. Moron, I muttered to myself. When I was finally off the bridge, I was back on the little country road where my tiny Cape Cod was. I pulled into the long driveway and parked my car into my small 1-car garage. I got out of my car, closed the garage door, and unlocked the door to my home. Stepping inside, my German Shepherd, whose name was Boss, greeted me excitedly. He had been asleep most of the day on my couch. Laziest guard dog I ever owned. I opened the back door and let him run around while I took off my coat and settled in. There was a loneliness about my home since Adrian had passed away, my companion of 15-odd years. I still hadn't become fully accustomed to her absence. We had moved out here in the middle of nowhere to escape the judgment of a small town. We were 2 women who had fallen in love, but she was nearly 15 years younger than I, and because I had never been a beautiful woman, nor had I ever really looked my age, I looked a bit older than I actually was. People would comment that she was my daughter. We decided it was better to live far away from town and our families. There was still the ridicule, but less so as we lived in our own world. I again found myself seeing her in everything around me. Adrian was beautiful and feminine, like a flower, always in a dress in winter. She had long blonde curly hair that was still a mess. Adrian spent her days working from home on her paintings. She sold many of them, and earnings helped pay our bills. I still recalled the first time I met her. She was at a housewarming party for a mutual friend of ours, Henry, who had just bought a house upstate. He introduced us, and my own shyness was apparent when she smiled brightly at me like a teenage schoolgirl, only she was in her late 20s. I was 42 at the time, carried myself awkwardly in oversized dress pants and a polo shirt for comfort. I had not planned to stay long, so I had not given meeting someone a second thought. Adrian and I hit it off, and she was the yin to my yang. The day that we found out that she was sick, it still stung whenever I thought about it. After 13, 15 years together, something as dumb as ovarian cancer took her from me. My gut told me it was time to eat, interrupting my loneliness after the long drive home from my job in the city. I rummaged around the fridge and finally settled on the ribeye at the bottom of my refrigerator. I prepped the steak for dinner by marinating it and set it out on the counter. As I prepared my food to be eaten, I noticed a calm sort of quiet that settled over my house. I stopped. What was I doing? I looked out the back door for Boss. He was nowhere to be seen, so I opened the back door to call out to him. Boss! Finally, I heard the tiny bells on his collar as he ran up the steps of the back porch and into the house past me. He had something in his mouth which I was able to identify as a leg from a baby doll? Probably the little girls that lived next door. They had moved abruptly 2 months ago, just before fall. I thought it was strange because when they left, it was in the middle of the night with no explanation. A family member had reported them missing and sent the police to their house. They left all of their belongings, uneaten food at the breakfast table, and oddly enough, They left their vehicle. The Masons were a sweet family. They had built the house next to me from the ground up 2 short years ago. It was so big and beautiful it put my own home to shame. They had a water view that faced Little Lake at the end of our short lane. To take such time and care to build the house and then to leave made it all the more strange to me. Adrian had spent a lot of her time watching them build the house. I recalled her updates to me each day when I returned home from work. Holding her from behind to kiss her cheek, she had raised her head up at me. "They're putting the deck in today, Sylvie. It's been really cool watching them build it from ground up." If only we had the money they have. It's such a big house. And I'll miss our view of the lake, I had said, irritated. "Oh, I hadn't thought of that," she had commented. Adrian would have been very shocked to know that they left that big old house. The Masons and their 2 small children were only neighbors, or only at that. The husband and wife were a young couple, Dan and Marcy. He worked in the city and she was a stay-at-home mom. She spent her afternoons homeschooling her 2 children. Sometimes they would have us over for dinner, or Adrian would drink with Marcy in the late afternoon before I returned home from work. I didn't mind that Adrian had other friends. I still couldn't believe that both Adrian and the Masons were gone now, and I was all alone on this empty road. I decided to be helpful that evening and shovel the snow from our little road. I still felt a neighborly responsibility to ensure that the Masons' drive was cleared of all snow and ice, just in case they returned. Maybe I was hoping they would expel me from the loneliness I felt every night when I came home to an empty house and street. I cleaned up my house and washed the dishes from the night before. I decided my steak had marinated long enough and turned on the broiler. Ball stared at me from his spot on the kitchen floor, waiting for me to throw him a piece of meat. I cut a piece of fat and tossed it in his direction. He looked up greedy for more. "1 piece is all you'll get for now," and Ball barked at me, licking his lips. "Oh, no you don't. Backtalk will get you nowhere, pup." I smiled at his spoiled demeanor and cooked the rest of my meal. I settled in the kitchen, turning on the news, and there was a story about a woman that had gone missing on one of the hiking trails near my home. Odd, but I figured it was no doubt because of the strange weather we had had lately. The story from the news lingered in the background of my mind. I was glad that I didn't have to leave my home for the rest of the weekend, since it was Friday. The thought of going out on that snow-covered, dark, and isolated road gave me the creeps after that story on the news. Instead, I readied myself for bed, taking off my clothes and settling in for my new favorite pajamas. They were Adrian's pajamas. I had lost so much weight in the last year, I slipped right into her old faded pajamas, the top and the bottom, with ease. If she were still alive, she would laugh at me for all of my weight loss, caused in part to my depression from missing her so much. I turned in for the night, pulling the covers nearly up and over my head as I cuddled myself. It made me feel close to Adrian as I held the cloth against my skin. How I missed her in these dark hours. And my only refuge was the darkness of night where I could sleep and dream of Adrian. It was late when I felt it brighten my room. It was as though someone turned on a light in my bedroom. It woke me from a dead sleep. It flashed twice, and then my room went pitch black again. I sat up in my bed and turned on the light next to my bedside. I got up figuring I would at least use the bathroom. I sat on the toilet, one eye open, and did my business. When I was finished, I washed my hands and stumbled back towards my bed, but not before stopping in the hallway to see Ball staring at something beyond the hall. I walked towards him and looked at him. "Hey, buddy. Well, what is it?" Balls remained fixated on something just at the end of the hallway. I walked towards the end of the hall and peered down the steps, which led into the small living room. There was a blinking light that was coming from outside. I walked down and looked out the front window towards my lonely street. There was something on the other side of the woods, and it was a yellow light. It blinked about every 5 seconds. I figured it was one of those salt trucks on the next street over. I didn't think anything of it, or the strange fact that it was so bright, Instead, I took my tired body back to bed. The next morning, I woke half naked, wearing only my pajama bottoms, and I was sleeping on the couch. I woke, topless, to a cold breeze that was coming from the front door. It was cracked open, just a bit, but not too noticeable. I stood, gathering my thoughts, and shut the door, locking it. I ran upstairs to my bedroom and looked for my pajama top. I couldn't find it anywhere. I decided I would look for it later and hopped in the shower. That afternoon, I was in my yard shoveling more snow for what seemed like the 80th time in 24 hours. I happened to see something blowing in the wind that caught my eye. Something was hanging from one of the mason's evergreen trees. It dangled near the top of the tree, some 20 feet in the air. I walked closer towards the Mason family's property line, and then I walked through their wooden gate. I kept going until I reached the tall evergreen. When I got just under the tree, I realized with ultimate perplexity that my pajama top was what was flowing in the wind like a beacon. I had no idea how that had happened. Perhaps I had begun sleepwalking and decided to throw it up to see how high it would go. I pushed the why into the back of my mind and went to get my ladder. I found it harder to steady the ladder in the ice and snow, but eventually I managed to stabilize enough. I was confident that it wouldn't plummet into the snow. I crawled up the ladder and managed to just barely reach the pajama top when I heard my name startling me. It was as though someone was whispering in the wind. I felt an icy chill go down my back, but it had nothing to do with the temperature. Either way, I felt uneasy and wanted to get to the top as fast as I could and go home to lock myself inside my house. I grabbed the head, but it was stuck to one of the branches, and as I quickly pulled it, I heard it rip. "Shit," I muttered to myself. I managed to collect the ruined top and get down from the ladder in one piece. I wasted no more time outside, and instead, I gathered myself and went inside my house, warming my body with a cup of tea. I was sitting on the couch watching some television program for no more than an hour when the electricity went off at my house. When it did, I saw a woman looking at me from the other side of my window. It could have been Adrian's twin. As soon as the electricity went off, it was back on in a matter of seconds, and the woman was gone. I stood up and went towards the window. There was no one outside. I grabbed my coat and walked right out the door. I looked down, and there were footprints in the snow. It was remarkable. They were the footprints of someone's small, bare feet. I called out into the cold. "Hello? Hello?" The only sound that met me was the wind. In the distance, the waves from the lake hitting up against the shoreline. I walked back into my home, and soon it was time for bed again. This night, I seemed to fall asleep much faster than the night before. I dreamt of Adrian that night. In the dream, she was staring across our property. She was looking at the Mason's house. I had put my hand on her shoulder. "What are you looking at?" Adrian said nothing. She only pointed towards the Mason's house. There was a bright light, so bright it covered the house. It was more brilliant than the sun and seemed to lift the entire house off the ground. I felt something touch my shoulder in the dream, waking me up out of a dead sleep. Black eyes met my own until I rubbed my eyes, blinking quickly. I turned the bedside lamp on and, looking around, I noticed there was nothing there except Boss, who was just staring up at me. I went to go get out of my bed when I saw someone walking in my hallway. I felt my body grow stiff. I was breathing, but my chest wasn't moving. I heard the floor to my house creaking, so I knew it was definitely not another dream. I stood up and peeked into the hallway. but I didn't see anyone. But then, I saw her. Adrian was standing at the end of the hallway smiling at me. Her long, curly hair, and that sweet smile. It had been so long since I had seen her. The last time I had seen her, she had no longer had that long, beautiful hair. Instead, she was pale, bald, and lifeless, as though Adrian were an alien. I had fought with her over the chemo treatments. Adrian didn't want them, but she was stage 4. I was afraid of her dying if she didn't do it. Adrian was adamant about going the holistic route. In the end, she died anyhow. The funeral was a depressing affair, more so than any funeral I had ever been to. Adrian's family was always in denial about who she was. I was asked by our mutual friend, Henry, who was close to our family, to bring specific items to the calling hours. They wanted photos of her, which I took great care in selecting. When I arrived, the funeral had actually begun an hour earlier than I was initially told. I walked over to Adrian's mother, who sat on a chair across from Adrian's casket. "Hello, I brought the photos you requested. Sorry I'm late. I could have sworn you said it began at 1 o'clock. Her mother had sat there and refused to look at me. Instead, she took the photos and handed them to Adrian's brother. He looked at me empathetically. "Things changed at the last minute," she finally said. One of her friends came over to her. "Oh, Marjorie, I'm so sorry about Adrian. Is this your other daughter?" the woman asked, looking at me, smiling. I smiled back awkwardly. "No, this is only an acquaintance of Adrian's." Adrian's mother had been so dismissive of me. I walked away angrily. I found my friend Henry as he was coming into the funeral home. "That woman," I said, clutching my fist. "Sylvie," he embraced me. "I'm so sorry." She referred to me as an acquaintance of Adrian's. A fucking acquaintance. I took care of her daughter for over 10 years, and in the last year I bathed her, I gave her medicine, wiped her tears, held her hand during her chemo, and this is the fucking thanks I get? I know you're angry, Sylvie, but we can't expect everyone to care as much about us as we do ourselves. The words cut like a knife, but he was right. Some people would never understand the love that we shared, and I didn't expect them to. I stood in my hallway now, looking at the apparition of my dead lover. I knew it was impossible, and yet there she was. I was so filled with grief that, was I now seeing these things? Was this all in my head? I watched as the apparition turned and walked towards the stairs. I followed until I found myself outside. There was a light illuminating the apparition of Adrian. She stood in my yard, and above was a towering machine. It was on 4 poles like legs, and in the center beneath was Adrian, waving me towards her. I stepped towards her, and then the light went out. I woke from my bed. This time, I was utterly naked, hanging off the edge of it. It was still dark outside, and as I stood, my legs barely working, I felt the urge to move towards my bedroom window. I opened the blind, and that is when I saw a ship hovering above the Mason's house. I couldn't take my eyes off the big ship. I wanted to go towards it, but I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Adrian smiling at me. She communicated with me through her mind. "No, Sylvie, you must stay here. For now." I stared into her bright eyes, and then they flickered until I saw them turn black, then back to bright blue. I myself being tucked into my bed by Adrian's apparition, and I drifted back off to sleep. The next morning, I woke fully clothed. I looked around thinking that it must have been some sort of strange dream. I got out of bed and went to make coffee. The sun had come out finally after the last 2 days of a pure whiteout. Standing in my kitchen, I heard it then. There was children's laughter coming from outside. I looked outside to find the Masons' 2 children playing in the yard. They were back? I put on my coat and boots and walked outside. I met Dan Mason in his driveway carrying firewood. Hello there. You have no idea how much you guys were missed. Oh, really? He asked, confused. You've been gone for 2 months. Dan looked at me and smiled. Well, we had our duties. As he walked away from me, I saw his 2 children and his wife, Marcy, stop what they were doing in the snow and all turned to look at me. They only stood saying nothing. It was as if they were waiting on some sort of cue for me. It was odd after they had disappeared. They were here again as though nothing happened. So odd. I have no idea to this day what happened the weekend of that blizzard. The strange lights occasionally appeared over my house, and I still had visits by Adrian, although I know it isn't really her. It creeps me out for sure when it happens, and after each visit from Adrian's apparition, I'm left with a warning that I need to get the hell out of here. So I've been looking at homes in another state, somewhere warm. You see, my neighbors do odd things at odd times of the day and night since their return, and I've been trying to deal with all the strangeness. However, as I type this, Dan and Marcy are outside watching my house. They do that sometimes, and I pretend not to notice them. So far, they haven't done anything to hurt me. The number of missing people near that forest by my house has tripled since the Masons came back. Some were tourists visiting the beautiful skyline near the opposite end of the lake. I think there's a correlation between their original disappearance and the missing people. I don't feel safe here anymore because, between you and me, I'm convinced that family that magically appeared after 2 months aren't really the Masons. I don't think I want to know who or what they are.